We've now seen that we can calculate GDP simply by adding up all the different categories of purchases in output markets on the left-hand side of the circular flow diagram. That's what gave us our equation, that real GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Now that's not the only way to calculate GDP. There's another way that focuses on flows through input markets as opposed to flows through output markets. But that way isn't as obvious from our version of the circular flow diagram, so we're not going to worry about it. Instead, we're going to focus on the most common way of understanding GDP as simply the sum of these different categories of purchases. But there are a number of other arrows in the circular flow diagram that are important to understand, and so we want to talk a little bit about those. Let's start with the government. We've already labeled the arrow here G. Then we have these arrows, one pointing up and one pointing down, and we know that the one pointing up represents tax revenues that flow from households to the government, and the one pointing down represents transfer payments from the government to households. We're going to denote the net effect of that as T. So T is taxes net of transfers. In other words, T is tax revenue minus transfer payments, which represents the net flow of money from households to the government. Then we have this arrow that connects the government to financial markets, and we know that arrow could in principle point in either direction. The reason we've made it point in this direction is because we're going to label this arrow as SG, which stands for government savings. Government savings is defined as the difference between taxes net of transfers and government purchases. This is what flows into the government, and this is what flows out of the government. So if what flows into the government is bigger than what flows out, SG is positive and we have a surplus. When we have a government surplus, then the government is paying off bonds, so money flows from the government into financial markets. If G is bigger than T, the outflows are bigger than the inflows, then SG is negative and we have a budget deficit. So now the government has to issue bonds, borrow money to cover that deficit, and now the direction of the arrow flips in the other direction. So when we label this SG, we know that when it's positive, we go in the direction of the arrow, and when it's negative, the arrow flips in the other direction. Then we can think about households, and we've already labeled this arrow as C. We've already labeled the net effect of these arrows as T. We have one remaining arrow, and we know that that is household savings. So now we have two arrows that point into financial markets: household savings and government savings. Together, these make up what we call domestic savings. So domestic savings is denoted by S, and it's simply equal to household savings plus government savings, where government savings could be positive or negative. So that's what flows into financial markets. What about what flows out? We've already labeled this arrow as I. Businesses draw on financial markets to come up with the financial capital to make investments in output markets. But then we have this arrow that connects to the rest of the world, which could point in either direction. And on this side we have an arrow that points towards our output markets, but it too could point in either direction. So let's talk a little bit about those arrows. When net exports are positive, it means we run a trade surplus. That means the rest of the world buys more from us than we buy from the rest of the world, and so dollars flow from the rest of the world to us. So when net exports are positive, the arrow points in this direction. When net exports are negative, we run a trade deficit. We buy more from the rest of the world than the rest of the world buys from us. And so now dollars flow towards the rest of the world. So a negative value for net exports flips that arrow, just as a negative value for government savings flipped this arrow. Now we also know that whatever happens on this side of the circular flow diagram with respect to the rest of the world has to be balanced by what happens on this side. So suppose we run a trade surplus. We run a trade surplus, which means that dollars flow from the rest of the world to us. From the perspective of the rest of the world, they are running a trade deficit with us, so they have to finance that trade deficit. And the way they finance that trade deficit is they borrow from our financial markets. So dollars would flow out of our financial markets to the rest of the world. How much do they borrow? They borrow exactly what that trade surplus is. So we can label this as net exports. When we run a trade surplus, dollars flow from the rest of the world to us. The rest of the world has to finance that by borrowing from our financial market exactly that amount. Now what if we run a trade deficit? Then the arrow is going to flip. We're buying more from the rest of the world than they're buying from us, so dollars flow in this direction. And now we're the ones with a trade deficit. We have to finance that trade deficit, and we finance it by borrowing from the rest of the world. So this arrow is going to flip, and this arrow is going to flip as well, because as we borrow from the rest of the world, money flows from the rest of the world to us, to our financial markets. So again, when that takes on a negative value, that arrow flips, and that same negative value over here is going to flip that arrow. So we now have a description of inflows and outflows from financial markets. And in equilibrium, it has to be the case that those balance, what flows in must be equal to what flows out. So we can simply now write the equation that falls out of this circular flow diagram. What flows in is domestic savings. What flows out is investment plus net exports, where net exports could be negative or positive. So that's an equation that falls out by thinking about balance on the right-hand side of the circular flow diagram. Now I want to talk about one more thing. If you think about GDP, it has to eventually flow through households. Whenever something is sold, someone is receiving that, so eventually someone, some person in some household receives whatever GDP is. So if that's true, then we simply can figure out what households do with their money, and if we add all of that up, we should get GDP. So what do households do with the money? They consume. So they consume. They pay taxes and receive transfers, the net effect of which is T. And they save. If those are the things that households do, and all GDP ultimately flows through households, that should be equal to GDP. But if we now have a second equation for GDP, we should be able to set these equal to each other. So that C plus I plus G plus NX should be equal to C plus T plus SH. Now we have C appearing on both sides. We can cancel the C. And now I'm just going to subtract G from both sides. So we're going to get I plus NX is equal to T minus G plus SH. But this T minus G is just equal to government savings. So we can write that as SG plus SH. And when we sum government savings with household savings, we just get savings. So now we have an equation that says savings is equal to investment plus net exports. Exactly what the circular flow diagram told us when we looked at inflows and outflows with respect to financial markets. So why did we just do this? Well, I simply wanted to illustrate that the circular flow diagram is internally consistent. Eventually everything has to add up. And there are lots of ways in which we can move around the circular flow diagram, but in the end it disciplines us to think clearly about an economy by making sure that we don't lose track of things, because ultimately everything ends up having to add up.